welcome to my YouTube channel. Last summer I posted a video on removal of a core support on a GMC Safari or Chevy Astro van. Although any spot welded in core support, a lot of the principles are the same. And the reason I was removing my core support was to hopefully replace it with a rust-free one. Mine, the bottom was very rusted up. I searched high and low for an excellent core support and had no luck. So my final option and what I did is I repaired the original. Links down below in the description. There's 4 parts on repairing the support there when it was off the vehicle. And say this is going to be part 1 of 2 of reinstalling the core support. This video here, as far as the welding part and that, is what it's going to pertain to. The last video on the core support install is going to be just putting the radiator back in and hooking all the wires up. The wrenching part of it, some of the parts of this video will pertain directly to core support install, especially if you're working on one of these vans. And other parts, since I had to fabricate. And rust repair is not exactly like in any 2 cases. It can give you ideas, but it's not an exact guideline. Watching this video though, you'll learn lots of welding and bodywork techniques. And best of all, most of the tools used in the video are under $100 with the exception of the MIG welder. I'm a fan of do-it-yourself and keeping old vehicles alive, so hope you get something out of this, and be sure to check out my other videos. Alright, the day has come to reinstall the core support I have been working on. If you followed along in the other videos on the repair, you'll know, like I say, we took a total rusted up piece of junk and turned it into a usable core support. And here is the core support to be installed. First step is going to have to go over, temporarily test fit it, and then we'll end up removing it again to cut some rusty metal out of our way where it's going to be fastened back into the main body of the van. Alright, temporarily have the core support vice grip here in place, clamped in. Now it's going to have to come back out, and the issue we're having I will show. Okay, up here in this inner fender, going to have to take, I knew this was a lot larger. Now if you would have bought a core support that wasn't rusty and didn't have to fabricate and such, well, it would be an exact fit. And also, you probably wouldn't have the rust back in here. What I'm going to do is take and put 2 marks, one probably about in here. I'll show you after I put the camera down in the marker, and here, and cut as much of this rust out as I can. And I'm just going to weld my piece back in farther than where the factory did. Alrighty, marked it over in here, and back in here, and I took a straight edge and drew a line with the marker, and that is where it is going to be cut out. Alrighty, there we cut that out. I want to temporarily bring the core support back over and see how, make sure didn't cut any too much off, but I think I'll be good. Okay, and our passenger side is trimmed back. Now what we're going to do, take a grinder and get rid of this undercoating and that back up into about here. So when the core support comes, it'll be a nice clean surface to weld to. Grind this down because we'll be welding around these spot weld holes on each side of the vehicle. Because the next time the core support comes over, it's going to get clamped in and it's going to be staying in. Right there is what I was talking about on the spot welds, where it's going to be back welded, so get good contact with the welder. And the shot up in inner fender I ground back in, should be more than enough. That was the passenger side, and here pretty much the same shot at the driver's side. And the shot on the driver's side up in the inner fender. I'm going to take and spray a light layer of primer over where this is ground. You still will be able to weld to it, and yeah, some of it will burn off when you weld, but It won't the whole way, and at least it'll give some protection between the layers of metal. Okay, it's back in for the final time. Soon we'll be doing the welding. Before the last time clamping it on, I put our bushings in first. You could in theory do it after, but you'd have to really jack the body away from the subframe up high. And there's the other one in. And I also took, to be sure all was lining up, I just loosely put the bolt in that's going to be holding it. And there's where we're lining up as close as you can to where it was drilled out the first time. And we're going to get the welder fired up here, and we're going to do a spot welds, show you. Alright, we're going to take and do a plug weld here. You want to take and clamp good on both sides of where you're drawing them. I'm going to do this one right here. And what you basically want to do is take your MIG gun torch, starting in the middle of the hole, start welding and filling it in. Alright, there's sort of what you're looking for. Like I say, these ones when you use the spot weld cutter that are larger in size, like if you use a 1/4 inch drill better to punch or harder to fill in. As I'm doing in the video, using a hammer and punch is a good idea around the plug holes to knock the metal of the van itself closer to the core support. And between welds, move your clamps close to each plug weld that you're going to be placing. And I'm using vice grips, C-clamp, whatever you have, and it'll clamp the metal firmly. And that's the biggest thing while you're doing this, to have the metal clamped firmly in place. And another little bit of a demonstration here of another plug weld. Right after you finish one of your plug welds is a really great time to take and use the hammer and punch to tap the metal in, because it's a lot more malleable when it's still warm than when it's cold. And using one of my favorite grinding tools, this electric 3-inch cutter tool, go ahead and clean the area up some more around where you're welding, and move your clamps again, and it's time for another plug weld. And in between, use a wire brush and clean the flux off. Unless you're using MIG solid wire with the shielding gas, then you will not have to do this step. Now it is time to weld again. And here's a little shot of the plug welds from the rear. Now I'm going to grind down the side. This is strictly up to you, but I have decided to weld the whole seam. Doing this will help keep out moisture and salt and make a stronger than factory job. The only thing is, if you ever have to take it apart again, it's going to be extremely difficult. But if this rusts again, I'm retiring the van. If I wreck the van bad enough, it needs change, the van is done. And when working with thinner metal, just weld about a 3/8 to a 1/2 inch at a time. And this is called stitch welding, and then just keep working back and forth in your area doing that until you connect all the welds together. And here's a little shot of the rear side when welding. You can see even the rear glows red from the metal melting together. After welding the sides, now it's time to weld the right and left corners of the top of the core support back to the van. As with the sides, get whatever grinding device you're going to use and clean the area good down to bare metal where you're going to be welding. And you can see why I like the 3-inch cutter tool. It's maneuverable into all sorts of positions. Now time to clamp again, and the same as the sides. Use vice grips, C-clamps, whatever works for you. Before I'm going to do the plug weld at the top, I'm first took and tacked it around the outside edge to help hold it in place along with the clamps, so it didn't want to pull apart while doing the plug welds. The core support now will be needed to be welded from the inner fender. To start with, using a rubber mallet, start forming the metal to contour to the vehicle. Use patience and keep working the metal, and it will pay off for you. To help aid in the welding process, you can use pop rivets to hold the metal in place. Using 1/8 inch rivets, preferably steel rivets, we'll start pulling the metal into place. After installing the first rivet, work the metal again with the rubber mallet. Now install another rivet about halfway across the metal of the core support. And one more rivet in this case will do the trick, and just put it there on the end. I found this to be the easiest way to hold, since there was no easy access to clamp the metal. And after the last rivet, use your rubber mallet again to shape the metal. And now, before we go weld, one more thing, take your grinding tool and grind the edges where it's going to be welded. Okay, after grinding, this is what the area should look like. And if the rivets bother you, after welding, you can drill them out and just weld the hole shut. Now it's time to weld again. Working up in this wheel well, it's a pain welding. Access is hard and you're welding overhead. But as before, weld about 1/4 to 3/8 inch small spot and work around the area back and forth with a hammer and punch in between the welds. You may find it easier at times to just use the hammer to tap with instead of the punch and the hammer. You can see the stitch welds now working back and forth. And when you get those all done, the stitch welds, you'll want to eventually weld the whole seam by welding between the stitch welds. And occasionally you're going to have to clean the flux with the wire brush, and in tight areas a small brush works better than a large one. Here is an example of what meant by stitching the welds together between the little spot welds. And now you can see the whole seam welded together. And a view from the back side of the weld looking through the core support from the front. And it's time to move on now and do the passenger side. I started using the little rubber mallet, but that was just not getting the job done. So a bigger hammer was in order. The driver's side, if you notice, pounded effortlessly into place, but the passenger side wants to fight, but we will win. And now, same as the driver's side, going to use steel 1/8 inch rivets to pull the core support metal into place into the van. And time to use the rubber mallet again. Now we'll install another rivet in the middle, and actually you can see I installed an extra rivet between the outside one and the one that is being drilled at the time. It was fighting and needed a little extra support to pull it into place. Now work the metal again with the hammer. This time I chose my little baby ball peen hammer, one of the handiest little fellows I've ever had. And now time for the final rivet before the welding process. It's done with the driver's side. First step is to prep the welding area. I always heard the first step to being a good welder is being a good grinder, and it's so true. And start with your first tack weld. The passenger side still wants to fight, so I had to revert to using the hammer and punch in between. Okay, the tack welds are all done, spaced out about 1 inch apart, and then themselves about 3/8 inch long. And you can see the completed seam. I can say working up in the inner fender is hard to do because you're welding overhead and the quarters are tight, but patience will pay off. And a view from the rear of the weld. I'm going to weld from the top also. This is optional, but I think it's going to make a good strong job and be less of a place for moisture to get in. And start by grinding. Clearance is tight and work however you can to make it happen. This is again the 3-inch cutoff tool prevails. Okay, you can see the top is now ready to be welded. If you look closely, I'm reaching in from the front of the core support to weld with my one hand. And again, just start with your tack welds and stop in between with the hammer and tap into place. Okay, the whole seam's welded. It is not the prettiest. For the close quarters in the area to work, it will do the job. And the view from the other side of the weld. Alright, now's the time to fix the lower left front corner where the van meets the core support. I'm going to place a mark with a magic marker above the rusted metal. And a good solid metal that can be welded to. This is a key thing because you try welding the rusty metal, it don't go real far. And measure from the bottom edge to the mark that was made. And then measure the same distance up at the wheel well side of the corner. Again, on what you're working on, you may need more of a patch, less of a patch. Then take a straight edge and draw a line across the marks that were made. This will be where we'll be cutting the metal out. The 3-inch cutting tool is back at work. I think I use this tool more than anything I have. After cutting the metal piece to be removed, it still did not want to come loose. And then, looking to my surprise, I missed a spot weld. Use an 1/8 inch drill bit and drill a pilot hole right in the middle of the spot weld. Now use the spot weld cutter, and the point in the spot weld cutter will sit right down in the 1/8 inch hole. And you do not want to drill through the second layer of metal with the spot weld cutter if you can help it, because if so, you're going to have to take and replace the hole where it made, because that's why you want the second layer, is what you're going to be welding back to. Now take and twist the metal back and forth, and only slightly pulling outward. You don't really want to bend out where it's going to be welded to, so it will break free. Now I'm going to measure the rusted piece of metal. At the curve in it, it's a little tricky to measure, but a tape measure will contour close enough. In my case, it measured 4.5 inches by 4 inches, and I find it a good idea to write it down on a scrap piece of paper or something when you measure this, in case you do get sidetracked, phone or something rings, so when you go back you don't have to go measure again. And the replacement metal will be cut larger. In my case, usually about 1 inch extra on each measurement will be fine. After putting the marks, a speed square works really well to draw the straight line where to cut. Or just the run-of-the-mill square will work too. And the magic marker, I have found, does work best to mark sheet metal. I like the small Sharpies with the fine pointy edge. Now just cut the patch panel out. If you take a C-clamp and mount it in a bench vise, and then hold the metal with the C-clamp, I feel works really well to cut smaller pieces of sheet metal. Before removing the metal from the bench vise, take your grinder and go around the edges where the metal was cut and get rid of the jagged edges that are hanging. Now weld the area on the vehicle where it's going to be welded to. This is pretty much true with any patch. Yeah, I know. Here we are with our 3-inch cutter tool again, my best friend. Now clamp the patch to the vehicle. The bottom worked great to clamp first to initially hold it in place. And then the front corner was clamped with vice grips. And then finally hit the rear corner. This will work for now because it'll be coming back off again. As in this situation, after you start getting the rough shape there with the metal, you can take and use a rubber mallet and work it some more. And with the patch still in place, take and place a mark there. The metal in this situation will need cut off. Maybe not all core supports, that it'll contour with the shape of the wheel well. If you have a good steady hand, you can mark it close enough just by eyeing it up like I did. Take and mark the lower edge where the metal will be plug welded with your marker. And mark the middle front corner of the core support. And line that up with the patch. And then trace around the edge to the outside edge of the patch. And I marked with a plus sign at the hole, and there will be a hole drilled here. Cut the corner off where the panel was marked while clamped. This is a little tricky cutting a curved shape, but it can be done, and then grind the edge while still clamped in place as before. Using a punch tool, punch out the hole that was marked on the bottom of the edge where the plug weld will be. You can also, if you don't have the punch tool, use a drill and a 3/16 to a 1/4 inch drill bit. Now, where the plus sign was drawn, drill an 1/8 inch pilot hole, and then drill a 1/4 inch hole where the 1/8 inch pilot hole was. Since drilling only sheet metal, I really did not find it necessary to use other size of drill bits going up to the larger hole, but that is up to you. And where the hole had been drilled, install a 1/4 inch flange nut. The flange nut is important, you'll see, and a bolt. This will be a tricky step coming up. Alrighty, after finger tightening the nut and bolt, tighten it with wrenches good and firmly. Now for the tricky part I talked about. We're going to attack the flange nut to the sheet metal. Keep the torch facing the flange nut so it gets the most heat, and get a tack weld at the 12, 3, 6, and 9 o'clock positions. Then gradually weld the whole way around the flange nut. Not the prettiest job, but it'll hold well and serve the purpose. Now I'm going to clean the back side of the patch up. My metal was getting a little bit rusty from sitting around, using a 36 grit flapper disc. And move your repair panel as needed to access all areas. After grinding, apply a light layer of primer. I know some will burn off from the welding, but some will stay and help keep rust at bay. Now we're all clamped back in, ready for the final welding. And time to use the rubber mallet again to start tapping the metal in place. And at the edge before welding, use the punch and the hammer and get the metal as close to the seam where it'll be welded. This will reduce the gap and make welding easier. Now, again, do another tack weld. And in between the tack welds, tap the metal seam again with the hammer. Now, after getting a couple tack welds top, good time to do a plug weld at the bottom. And the big purpose on getting sort of working gradually around the metal is to get it fastened in place that all the clamps can be taken out of your way. Life is a lot easier when you don't have to work around the clamps. Okay, now I'm going to move on to the right front passenger side, and as with the driver's side, mark the area where it's going to be cut out. My grinder wheel should be changed. It's getting sort of small for the angle I'm cutting at, but it will still get the job done this time. Now carefully pry the metal back free of the vehicle, and this side did not have to drill the spot weld because it was just too rusty to worry about drilling. Alrighty, the rusty metal is now removed. Now using the grinder again, grind the area down to be welded to. The grinder wheel's decreased size is now quite in my favor. Using the old rusty metal, take some measurements, and they are about the same as the driver's side. I don't think there was any smaller or larger. I pretty much stayed in the same area. And this time around, I'm going to have to square my metal up before measuring to cut the patch panel. My metal always ends up in unusual shape till you're done cutting patch pieces out. Now, got the squared off taken care of. Going to mark the first cut of the repair patch and mark using the speed square. And just cut it off following the magic marker as before. Now measuring for the final cut. Now the metal's cut to the proper size. I don't believe I mentioned this on the other side. You can initially form the metal just by hand, just to get the basic shape. And there's an example of roughly the basic contour of what is going to be needed. Now, holding the patch panel, draw a line where it will be welded, but not cut. Mark the spot to drill for the fender mount. Then going to take and move the patch into the bench vise and first drill the 1/8 inch hole and then the 1/4 inch hole with the drill bit. And taking a bolt and flange nut just as the other side, tack weld it in place at the 12, 3, 6, and 9 o'clock position approximately. And eventually working gradually around the flange nut, weld the whole way around the circle. And if ever you have trouble, I've mentioned this before, if you have trouble getting the welder started, take a time out in the wire brush and clean the flux off. And there is a picture of the nut completely welded around the flange of the nut. Now, line the patch back up into place and clamp the repair panel in place. Have to remove the patch again to cut off excess metal to be able to make the holes for the plug weld. Now, if you just wanted to take and drill, you could let the overhang, but I'd sooner have it tightened up, less metal to rust. And any time you're working with metal, make it a little larger, then a little smaller. You can always cut it off, but you can't make it larger. Now, clamp back in place, going to mark the spots where the plug welds are going to be. And one more time, removal of the patch is necessary. The holes are going to be made for the plug weld. And going to use the air punch to make the holes. And remember to cut about a 1/2 to 3/4 inch smaller around the vehicle where the patch is going to be. And clamping first at the bottom works best in this situation. And then I'll take and clamp the wheel well side. This time a C-clamp seems to be working better. And last but not least, clamp the front corner. Same as on the driver's side. Using a hammer and punch, form the patch closer to the vehicle's metal. Now taking the MIG torch, we will be creating the first tack weld. And after the first tack weld, as quickly as possible, use the hammer and punch again while the metal is still warm and more malleable. And you can see the patch now is completely tack welded in place. Took then and did one of the plug welds on the bottom. And you want to finish welding between the tack welds until the seam is completely welded. And there is a rear view of the plug weld. On the wheel well opening, instead of, as I did on the driver's side, doing it off the vehicle, I chose to just cut the wheel opening after the patch was in place and welded fast. And now we're going to grind the front corner of the core support to prepare to weld the patch metal. Using a rubber mallet, form the patch panel around the corner of the van. And weld the corner of the patch to the core support. Just as before, do a tack weld, tap metal, and repeat until the whole seam is done. And there is the finished seam. And here from the wheel well is an extra gap that needs filled in. A 4" by 4" piece of metal is a good start for fabrication. Starting, I grinded a rounded corner into the patch so it mates to the vehicle contour. And then a 1/2 inch edge was bent, and more trimming will be needs done where the metal was marked. And after trimming, some more preliminary bending was done. If you would have found a factory core support that wasn't rusty, this extra fabrication would not have been necessary. And there is a view of the patch welded inside the inner fender. Now the other side has to be closed in. A 3" by 4" piece of metal is the starting point for this patch. And I'm going to place a 90-degree bend to start forming this patch to work in this area. And there the bend is done. Now with the metal in the bench vise, going to cut out the corner and bend the metal again where it is marked with the marker. Trimming the extra piece off is now done. That's not needed. And in my case, this is the starting point. Now I have to cut out where the metal was marked again. And another cut is still needed. holding the patch in place to test fit and soon to be welded. And there's a view of the right front core support the van welded shut. I have included these pictures for a guideline. Rust repair is in no two cases the exact same, but this should give you some ideas for your particular situation. And there is a view of the left side, welded back shut. A little trimming is required on the left front corner. Again, use this as a guideline. Not all situations will be identical. And some may think this is overkill. If it is, just don't do it. But I'm going to grind the welds, even if they are going to be hidden by the fenders when they're back on. And starting with a 24 grit disc and a 4.5 inch grinder, we'll take the rough of the welds down. And a view after the initial grinding. And in hard to reach grinding areas, I seek the help of my 3-inch cutter tool, my best friend. After most of the welds are ground down, I prefer smoothing the area up with a 36 grit flapper disc. And the finished grinding looks nicer than the welds, and I will admit it'll help keep the rust away also. Again, the grinding is optional, but it does make a nice job. Yes, I even ground the welds and the inner fender for a nice touch. The van is starting to take shape, and the extra work, as you see, does pay off. Using wax and tar remover, now wipe down the bare metal. Do this by soaking one rag with cleaner and wipe back and forth, drying with another rag that is dry. Now I'm going to apply a layer of primer. I'm going to use 2 coats, but I'm just going to show you the start here with the first light coat. And there is a shot of the ground and primed areas, ready for paint. Yeah, between the primer and the paint, hopefully you'll keep the rust away for a while. And now I'm going to apply a layer of short strand Bondo glass fiberglass filler. And just like body filler, this just has short strands in it. It's 2 parts that has to be mixed. A scrap piece of cardboard is best used to mix on because you can just throw it away. And it's also 2-sided. You can get 2 mixes out of 1 scrap. Using a putty knife, place some of the fiberglass on the cardboard. And now squeeze some hardener out of the tube on top of the fiberglass. First mix the hardener and fiberglass to start with the putty knife. Then using the plastic or rubber applicator, scrape the putty knife off. And finish mixing with the applicator. Use the applicator and start applying the fiberglass to the primed areas. And there's a variety of different sanders that I personally use. And after the fiberglass hardens, usually about 10 to 15 minutes, you can take like your nail and rub against it, and if you can like scratch it, it's more than likely ready to sand. Start sanding with no coarser than 80 grit, but probably no more than 100 grit for your first round of sanding. The fiberglass layer with the short strands doesn't smooth to a real fine finish, and it is harder to sand than body filler. You'll see that if you have never worked with it before. And in tight areas, if all else fails, resort to manual sanding with your hands or a multi-function oscillating tool. Okay, the passenger side now needs sanded, since we did the driver's side first. And as you see, this little air sander is a very handy tool, and it's also a dual action air sander besides its size. It don't just turn, it actually also oscillates. Okay, now we can apply a light layer of body filler over the fiberglass for a nice job. And it mixes just like the fiberglass, just takes a whole lot less effort because it's thinner without the fiberglass strands, and it's a lot easier to mix. And come sanding time, it definitely does sand easier. It makes more dust, but it sands a whole lot easier. And there you can see the multi-function oscillating tool in those tight quarters doing what it does best. It's slow, the multi-function oscillating tool, but it does do a nice job. Okay, sanding is completed and ready for priming. For priming, blow loose the loose dust using compressed air and wipe the area down with wax and grease remover, using 2 rags, one to apply and the other to dry the area. Next, I'm going to personally use aerosol primer, lightly coat the area where the body work has been done. Here is a view after the first layer. In about 10 minutes, the second coat will be applied. And you can see the final coat of primer is applied, and notice you can no longer see the color of the body filler coming through. I personally, when it comes to aerosol primer, I like the high build aerosol primer Harbor Freight sells, but other brands will work. That is a decision you will have to make. Reaching down from the top of the core support, I coated the bottom inside of the passenger side where the core support meets the body of the van. And next was the driver's side, which was almost impossible to prime, but I managed through the hole in the front of the core support, as you can see in the picture. Also, sanding in the wheel well is a pain, but at least only sanding the fiberglass. No putty is going to be used here. In my opinion, the fiberglass looks fine in the wheel well after blowing the dust off. And as before doing the priming, wipe the area down with the wax and grease remover. The wheel wells will get 2 coats of primer, waiting 10 minutes between coats as before. Now I'm going to do the same deal on the passenger side. Sand, wipe down, and prime. This all might seem a lot of extra work, and if you don't want to, you don't have to do it, but I do believe in the long run it will pay off. And using 2-inch masking tape and a utility knife, tape off the core support bushings. Not easy to get the tape wrapped around, but it can be done. Just patience and keep working with it. Now, using masking tape and scrap newspaper, I'm going to tape off the subframe where I don't want to paint or be too close that the paint may get on it. Working on a flat surface makes it easy to make the tape stick to the paper. And as your situation warrants, tape off all areas you do not want painted. Here is a view of where I taped. As I said before, use this as a guideline. If you're not working on one of these vans, it's going to be somewhat different where you're going to be taping off. I'm going to coat the inner fender areas with this Harbor Freight chassis and grill paint. It covers really well. I do not know how it will hold up in the long run. I started using the paint on this van just this year, so give it a year or so, I'll tell you my opinion. Okay, it's all coated now in the inner fender. Now I can finally stand up again. Lots of luck, that won't last long. Now I bought this Valspar flat grain paint at Ollie's cheap for $1.99, and I'm going to use this to cover the primer. And as you can see, I'm first coating the inside of the top of the core support. This isn't real easy. Actually, I was going to paint this off the vehicle, but to all the welding and putting it in, I figured it'd be so marked up it was sort of a useless cause. And work from any angle possible as needed to accomplish the inside of the core support. Relief. Now applying the paint to the accessible areas. Coats will be used until the van's finished to the flat grain. On the first coat, just lightly cover the primer. The second coat is where you can really put the paint on thick. Work around all corners as proceeding with the paint, and there's lots of corners in this core support. Now I'm going to apply Valspar clear also, as you see, Ollie's cheap $1.99. With the flat paint and the clear, I felt gave a factory clear coat appearance. Again, this vehicle is being fixed for a driver, not a show vehicle. If it was a show vehicle, yes, I would have got the paint gun out and had paint mixed and went all out on it. But again, it's just a driver. And as soon as possible, when your paint's dry enough, pull your paper and masking tape off. The longer you wait, the more difficult it can be to remove, especially in hot, humid weather, which isn't the case right now, but it is more humidity, the worse it'll stick. Now, the last step in this video, there's going to be two parts on the reinstall, is going to be tightening these core support bushings. Tighten with a 1/2-inch drive ratchet, and in this case, an 18mm socket, is till it tightens up, snug it up real good. And then when it don't turn, you can just feel right when it starts to really tighten up. Then you can finish it with a torque wrench, and the torque on them are 65 foot-pounds.